So in this first video lecture, I would like to cover the evolution of labor unions in the public sector and the status of labor unions today. And we're going to skim the surface of a number of topics we'll touch on later in the semester. But I thought this would be a good time to talk about how labor unions have developed. And so the the strength of labor unions in the public sector lagged behind labor unions in the private sector. So when the private sector workers were starting to organize and collectively bargain and fight for their rights, uh, there was still this idea that public employees did not um, really deserve this power to negotiate wages and benefits. So, first off, uh, collective bargaining, which I'll get into the process more later in a different lecture, but collective bargaining is in basic terms is when you have a workforce that binds together and negotiates with their employer what the wages and working conditions are in the workplace. So they negotiate a salary, benefits, different working conditions depending on what area they're in. If you're police officers, it might be how many police are on duty at once, or you might negotiate different equipment for firefighters. If you're teachers, you might negotiate class sizes along with, of course, pay and benefits. So in non-unionized workforces, the pay is not as standardized across the workforce. It's not collectively bargained. So your employer can pay one person more than the other. They can give a bigger raise to one person than the other. And those mechanisms exist within collective bargaining agreements to give different raises to different staff members, but for the most part, everybody is governed under one contract that is negotiated uh, uh, by a bargaining team, and so that's in general collective bargaining. We'll talk about that actual process next week, but the idea of labor unions and labor union strength and being able to collectively bargain and withhold your services if you're not happy with your pay, going on strike, that kind of thing. Those powers of labor unions were accepted in the private sector before they were accepted in the public sector. Even pro-labor politicians rejected the idea early on of um, labor unions in the public sector. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who favored labor unions in the private sector, publicly stated that public employees are different because they're not negotiating in the same way. The process of collective bargaining can't happen in the same way for public service as it does for the private sector, private employees, which gets at what the difference is between public and private sector employees. So basically, in general, what we're talking about is that your private employees, the reason that labor unions were considered more legitimate uh, uh, prior to in the private sector prior to the public sector is because private employees are negotiating for corporate profits. If your McDonald's staff unionizes and they negotiate higher wages, those wages are going to increase the labor costs for the McDonald's corporation, and it's going to cut into their profits. You're negotiating for a share of profits. In the public sector, you're negotiating for a share of tax dollars. And so there's an opposition to public employee collective bargaining because they can't just uh, they can't cut into corporate profits. They're not just um, cutting into the corporate profits. You're negotiating with people to cut into tax dollars, and so that can create an increase in tax dollars and make government less efficient. So then your public is paying more for services that they could be getting for less. So that's the general idea that public service you couldn't really negotiate in the same way that you negotiate in the private sector. Also, government can't really go out of business. So if the federal employees negotiate for higher wages, it's just going to lead to raising taxes, and not it's not going to have the same consequences that it would if you negotiate with a private company and they start spending too much money on labor costs. Then you're going to make the company go out of business, which is bad for everybody within the company, workers and management. So there was this idea for a long time throughout American history that labor unions in the public sector and collective bargaining in the public sector was not really a legitimate idea. This started to change as public employees became it became very well known that public employees were not getting treated very well. Their pay lagged far behind private employees, and so there became a lot of labor unrest. So Wisconsin was actually the first state to extend collective bargaining to the public sector in 1959. Some of their local employees were then able to collectively bargain for better wages and better benefits. At the federal level, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 10988, which extended collective bargaining rights to federal employees. Even with extending bargaining rights, there were certain things that they weren't allowed to bargain, and the states that extended bargaining rights did have things like strike provisions, which would prevent people like the police from striking. Because if the police go on strike, that's not the same as laborers in the factory going on strike. If Ford makes fewer cars one day because the Ford workers go on strike, that has different consequences. They just make fewer cars that day. Whereas if all the police don't show up to work, that's a public safety problem. So even in extending these rights to the public sector, many public employees did not get the right to strike. Nonetheless, starting in 1959 and with President Kennedy's executive order, we started to see state governments and the federal government start to accept collective bargaining as a legitimate process in the public sector. There was a slew of teacher strikes and other public worker strikes in the 1960s and 70s that led to a lot of school closures for weeks at a time, garbage collectors going on strike, and this led to a lot of public unrest, that kids weren't going to school, the schools were constantly closing because the teachers were on strike. Even if it was illegal, they'd go on strike. So extending collective bargaining rights, giving the public employees the seat at the table to negotiate, was supposed to be a mechanism for keeping them working. If you give the teachers, if the teachers are going on strike because they are not getting paid well, then you give them collective bargaining rights. The idea was, once they have the collective bargaining rights, they now have a seat at the table, they can negotiate better wages, and when they collectively bargain a contract, they can also bargain, the administration can bargain provisions in that contract to keep them from striking. So you keep the schools open, and you make the teachers happy, you negotiate. It's a give and take. And so this was the idea. We started to extend these rights into the public sector. So throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we saw public employees become more unionized, while we also saw states passing right-to-work laws, which hurt unionized workforces in the private sector. So now what you see is labor unions are stronger in the public sector than they are in the private sector. And it used to be the opposite prior to the 1960s and 70s. So, public sector unions became very strong in a number of states, mostly the non-right to work states, and these rights got extended to a lot of public employees throughout the United States. And around the time of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, 2010, states started to try to roll back these collective bargaining rights for public employees because they were starting to be viewed as too powerful. The pendulum kind of swings one way to the next. First, management had a lot of power, then the labor unions had a lot of power. Now states are starting to take back some of those collective bargaining rights to try, and their explanation is to try and control budgets. So where we're at today is that we have some states where unions are very strong in the public sector. You have strong public teacher unions and police unions and firefighter unions and state and local employee unions. And then you have other states where they're not so strong, where they aren't unionized, or they're unionized but they don't collectively bargain. And what we've seen is we've seen labor unrest in various ways in all of those states, but in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of teachers go on strike in states where they don't have collective bargaining rights. So West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, a lot of those teachers went on strike and closed the schools, much like we saw in the 1960s and 70s. So where we're at today is kind of a division based on state. Some states have strong public employee labor unions. Some states don't have strong public employee labor unions. Some states have collective bargaining. Some states don't. In Georgia, firefighters are legally allowed to collectively bargain, but I believe the only ones that have a bargaining agreement currently are the firefighters in Savannah. So, so that's the status of unions today, and how it differs throughout the states. There's also a major court case that happened recently, Janus v. the American Federal, State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME. In Janus v. AFSCME, the Supreme Court ruled that public employee labor unions could no longer collect agency fees or fair share fees automatically from paychecks. So what would happen is labor unions would negotiate contracts, and then they would deduct fees from they would have the employer deduct fees that are paid to the labor union from the workers in order to pay for the cost of negotiating that contract. So those are now those deductions are no longer legal, which is going to probably further make labor unions in the public sector weaker. Though some states have responded in different ways to either protect labor unions or not protect labor unions. So public employees, depending on the state, have different rights. They are all covered under civil service laws, and it is a different animal than in the private sector. We will be focusing on the public sector and labor relations and how managers deal with labor relations in the public sector throughout the course. Thank you.